morning, fellow treasure hunters and explorers. Today I'm going to help you guys out by starting to read to you one of my favorite treasure books by my favorite treasure author, and that's George A. Thompson. You've heard me reference many times in previous videos of the lost treasures on the old Spanish Trail. I was good friends with George Thompson when he was alive, and I wrote letters to him and corresponded with him many times, and he was always good to answer back, and he's a very good writer, and he documented everything that he did. And that's one of the things that many treasure writers do not do, is they use legends and treasure stories, and they interview different people, but it's all word of mouth. They don't have any documentation for it. And that's what I have always admired about George Thompson, was he was a consummate researcher. And that's what I am as well. I do a large amount of research before I ever go into the field. And when I go into the field, I know what I'm looking for and have an idea of where I'm going. There is something in a treasure that fastens upon a man's mind. He will pray and blaspheme and still preserve, and will curse the day he heard of it, and will let his last hour come upon him unawares, still believing that he missed it by only a foot. He will see it every time he closes his eyes. He will never forget it until he is dead, and perhaps not even then. There is no getting away from a treasure that once fastens itself upon your mind. Written by Conrad Nostromo. And here's the preface. The old Spanish Trail, from the arrival of the first Americans in the West, has been a mystery like a giant jigsaw puzzle, with some of the pieces missing. Until recently, about all we knew for sure was that it existed. But we didn't know who first used it or when. But newly discovered documents and journals have added a few more pieces to the puzzle, so that now we can set the record straight and tell its story as it really is. Some historians have exclaimed the old trail is of recent origin, first used by Mexican merchants and later by American fur trappers who came to the Great Basin after Mexican independence from Spain in 1821. Nothing could be further from the truth, for the old trail is an ancient one, followed by the first conquistadors. It was named by Don Antonio Espejo in 1580, but it was an old trail even then. In the days of Cortez, the old trail started at Mexico City, but by the time of Coronado, its trailhead was located as far north as Compostela and even Culiacan. It would soon be pushed even further northward to El Paso del Norte. In 1598, Jean de Ornate established its most northerly outpost at Santa Fe, and by the mid-1600s, its many forks extended from Colorado and Utah far into Wyoming, Idaho, and Nevada. Those are facts with enough evidence to convince any open-minded person. There is no doubt that the Spanish adventurers, miners, slavers, and priests traveled the old trail to nearly every desert canyon and snowy peak between the Rockies and the Sierras, while the Pilgrim Fathers were still exploring the rocky coast of New England. The old Spanish Trail had but one purpose: to serve as a roadway to the legendary land of Cibola, and the treasure of gold and silver waiting to be found there. It wasn't for commerce, or to civilize the Indians, or even convert them to Christianity. Its only purpose was Cibola and gold. And those who followed it were treasure hunters first, and missionaries afterwards. And contrary to popular belief, Cortez wasn't the first treasure hunter, only one of the most successful. And Cibola wasn't invented during the time of Coronado. It was a legend old even at the time of Columbus. While countless thousands were following the old trail north in search of treasure, the dream of Cibola died with the Coronado expedition on the barren plains of Kansas. But the death of Cibola gave birth to an even greater dream, the quest for the mysterious lake of Copala and the fabled land of Tigüello. It was the search for Tigüello, not Cibola, that opened the entire Great Basin to exploration. There on the Iberian Peninsula, there are ancient petroglyphs that show, and this is my own interpretation, but show the 7 cities of, and we know that is the area where that legend originated, on the Iberian Peninsula. And so the reason that story came about was because of earlier explorers that had actually visited this continent and had established or had seen these cities and experienced some of the things that they saw, and then brought that legend back with them. Now it's open to a lot of discussion, but from my own research, I have found evidence that these 7 cities did exist, and we have a location that we're focusing on that matches in every detail. It's right along the old travel route of the Aztec. It fits in every way, and we have local Native American legends that back up this research and these ideas and our research. It is my belief that these earlier adventurers had been to this continent and seen these 7 cities, and then when they returned home, they documented that in their writings and in their petroglyphs and in their records. They made that as permanent as they could. And I've shown videos where I've overlaid the petroglyph next to this location and shown that it matches as close as you could make anything match. And so what George Thompson is saying here is based on evidence. It's not just a bunch of fantasy or made up stories. There's too many tendrils of evidences from the old world to the new world. So when Columbus came here, Cibola was a legend, and Coronado followed that legend and tried to find it. And of course the Indians either didn't know or understand by the name, or the civilization had moved on, and this information was lost. And I think when the Spanish threatened the Indians, they took them on a wild goose chase because they didn't know where to take them. This 7 cities is also talked about in the Aztec records. They talk about the place of emergence. It's an underground city. It's in the north. It's a place where they had gold and silver and great wealth. And it's a place where they lived before they moved to Mexico City and started their new civilization. From the time of Captain General Francisco Coronado in 1540 to that of Father Geronimo Salmeron a century later, every explorer sought the great lake which the Indians called Copala, and the rich mines in the mountains beyond in the land they called Tigüello. By the middle of the 17th century, Spanish miners had found many of the Indians' mines and claimed them as their own, sentencing their former owners to forced labor in them. After the northern mystery was solved, the rich region underwent many name changes, from Cibola to Tigüello, and later from Timpanogos to Utah Valley. But the old Spanish trail didn't end there. For another 100 years, Spanish miners and Mexican slavers followed it even further north to rich mines in the Uinta and Wind River Mountains and beyond. All across the Great Basin and the mountain ranges which surrounded it, Spanish miners worked mines of gold and silver with Indian slave labor, while Jesuit priests built missions where the natives' life was no less harsh than it was in the mines. Those missions were not the splendid churches we usually associate with the Southwest, but were more often vistas, crude places built of adobe or rubble stone, boasting little more than a rough plank altar. In every western state, the first French and English trappers and later the mountain men and pioneers found long abandoned Spanish mines and the crumbling ruins of Jesuit missions. Proof of their antiquity can be seen in the names, dates, and Catholic crosses carved on ancient trees or inscribed onto ledge rock along the old trails leading to them. Although some of the dates are dim and the names are now unknown, the fact that they are there can't be denied. And they were old when the earliest explorers first saw them. There isn't an Indian name that doesn't have legends or traditions of forced labor at Spanish mines or missions. One only need research ancient Spanish civil or church records to learn the extent of slavery and the terrible toll it took on the Indians. Nearly every journal left by the explorers of the Mountain West contains reference to the Spanish slave trade and of slave markets at places like Taos and Santa Fe. Official Spanish documents located at the archives of Santa Fe, Mexico City, and Seville reveal that $10 billion in gold and silver was shipped to Spain from the mines of the New World. $10 billion. That's a lot of gold in that days. $10 billion in gold and silver was shipped to Spain from the mines of the New World, during which time the Indian population was decimated by one half. It is a fact that almost every ounce of precious metal sent to the royal court came from Spanish mines worked by Indian slaves. The enslavement of the Indians finally led to revolts which drove the Spaniards from their mines and resulted in the expulsion of the Jesuit order from their mountain missions. It took nearly 2 decades before Spanish soldiers could force their way back into the mountains. During that time, most of their mines had been concealed and their missions destroyed. Fabulously rich mines such as the famed Josephine de Martinique, Elmina del Tiro, and the Lost Mine of the Utahs were never found. While mysterious maps and cryptic waybills were left to lead the way to cached mission treasures, it was a time when legends were born and most of them true. After the Spaniards were driven from the land and the Americans replaced the Mexican pioneers, settlers found many of the old mines and missions, but many more were never found. The Spanish conquistadors had shipped more gold and silver to Spain than was then known in the entire rest of the world combined. But still more was left behind, most of it hidden in mines concealed during the Indian Revolt, or buried by Jesuit priests when they were arrested and expelled from their missions. For every old mine or mission found, many more are still lost. The greatest treasure of all still remains to be found. And what of the old Spanish Trail? Traces of it can still be found at places like the Sinbad Desert and Canyonlands, where it is worn deeply into soft sandstone rock by the passing of countless pack trains. Heavily laden with plundered treasure, it can be easily followed from the Spanish bottoms on the Colorado River, where hand-cut steps can still be seen, to the San Rafael River, where ancient dates and Catholic crosses are cut into the ledge rock. Traces of it remain from the Wasatch Mountains to the Monument Valley, and across the deserts of New Mexico to the Texas Gulf Coast, where Spanish galleons waited to carry fortunes in gold and silver to the king's coffers at Seville and Madrid. The old Spanish Trail is real. It can still be seen from the deserts of Sonora on the mountains of Wyoming, and the fabulous lost mines and forgotten missions along its lonely miles are real too. But their lost treasures are harder to find. With a lot of research and a little luck, The following pages could be your waybill to the lost treasure of the old Spanish Trail.